This is a video on how to lubricate cables on a 2011 Ninja 250. We will lubricate the clutch cable, the two throttle cables, and the choke cable. We will show every step in detail. We will start by lubricating the clutch cable. As you can see, it is possible to disconnect the lower end of the clutch cable without removing the right fairing, but to make it easier for the camera to see, we'll remove the right fairing. Remove the right side cover. There is one Phillips head screw and 3 stoppers inserted in grommets. Gently pull out the 3 stoppers one by one. There are 2 large hex bolts, one at the bottom of the bike and one at the middle of the bike. Keep your hardware in an organizer to prevent loss. This is a very inexpensive DeWalt organizer purchased at Home Depot. It is compact and has 2 halves, one used for the right fairing hardware and the other for the left fairing hardware. The dividers can be repositioned. Now we will remove the second large hex bolt located at the middle of the bike. Disconnect the turn signal by pushing on the very end of the tab on the connector. You may need to use quite a bit of downward force on the tab to separate the connectors. There are 2 smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. And there are 2 more hex bolts at the front of the bike, which are screwed into well nuts. The last hex bolt connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Be aware that this bolt can be somewhat finicky to remove. It has a tendency to get caught up on the radiator fairing once it is removed from its threads. Keep track of the nut plate. Sometimes the nut plate will be clamped on tightly, other times it will fall off. This is what the nut plate looks like. The bolt screws in like so. If the plate does fall off, be sure to keep it in your organizer. There are 3 small plastic rivets that secure the radiator fairing against the side and front fairings. You will only need to remove the lower 2. The third upper rivet connects the radiator fairing with the front fairing and is not necessary to remove. Disengage the rivets by pushing the button at the center with a pencil or some thin piece of plastic. Once the rivets are disengaged, they can easily be pulled out with fingernails. If you are interested in how these rivets work, here's a demonstration. The rivet is installed with the middle piece raised up. Notice that in this configuration the teeth are not flared out, and thus the rivet is not activated. After the rivet is installed, it is activated by pushing the middle piece inward like so. Notice that the teeth are flared out, which means the rivet is activated. To deactivate the rivet, the middle piece is pushed further in like so. Notice that the teeth are not flared out, which means the rivet has been deactivated. To reset the rivet, simply push the middle piece back out. Now we will remove the second rivet. Again, the third rivet does not need to be removed. It connects the radiator fairing with the front fairing, not the side fairing. There are 3 large rivets at the bottom of the fairings that hold the right and left fairings together. These rivets are designed differently from the small rivets. To remove them, use a flathead screwdriver to take out the inner part of the rivet, and then the remaining part will be easy to free from the hole in the fairings. If you are interested in how these rivets work, here's a demonstration. The rivet is installed with the middle piece removed. Notice that the teeth can easily be pushed inwards, which means that the rivet is deactivated. Once the primary piece is installed in the fairings, the inner piece is pushed into it. Notice that the teeth cannot be pushed inwards, which means that the rivet is activated. To deactivate the rivet, simply pull the middle piece out with a flathead screwdriver. Notice that the teeth can easily be pushed inward again, which means that the rivet is deactivated and can easily be removed. Here is the second large rivet. And the third large rivet. When removing the fairing from the bike, you must keep track of 2 well nuts, 1 pad, and of course the nut plate mentioned previously. These are the 2 well nuts. The 2 hex bolts removed previously screw into them. They are black rubber with inner metal threading. The pad is supposed to stick onto the fairing but typically falls off. This is where the pad is supposed to be located. You can see the sticker residue. And this is the pad. It protects the gas tank from friction against the fairing. This pad was left uninstalled for thousands of miles. You can see where the fairing has rubbed against the gas tank. Now we will disconnect the ends of the clutch cable. There is a certain sequence that you must follow to disconnect the cable ends. This sequence may seem overly complicated, but it is necessary to gain the slack required to disconnect the cable ends. Begin by loosening the lock nut at the upper cable end and thread it as far away from the lever mount as it'll go. Then turn the barrel adjuster so that it moves into the lever mount. Move it towards the lever mount as far as it'll go. This will maximize cable slack at the upper end of the cable. Then loosen the lock nuts at the lower end of the clutch cable with two 12mm open-ended wrenches and rotate the lock nuts until they move as far up the threads as possible. This maximizes slack at the lower end of the cable. Then at the upper end of the clutch cable, line up the slots on the lock nut and barrel adjuster with the slot on the lever mount so that the cable can be removed. Line up the cable with the slot under the lever so that the cable can be removed from the lever. This is what the barrel adjuster looks like if you thread it out of the lever mount, but you don't need to thread it out of the lever mount. This is for visual reference only. At the bottom end of the clutch cable, move the dust cover out of the way and remove the lower end of the clutch cable from the bracket. Be aware that this can be very difficult if you do not remove the cable end in a certain way. To do this, move the bracket towards the engine as you try to push the cable end out of the bracket. I'm not sure if this plastic piece at the upper end of the cable is OEM or aftermarket. I haven't been able to find it on parts diagrams. We are now ready to lubricate the cable. We will use a cable luber tool. This tool decreases in diameter as the cable moves farther into it. You may be able to see ridges in the black rubber inside the tool. This gap will close as the tool is tightened on the cable. This is the hole where the tube of the aerosol can is inserted. Insert the cable into the luber until you feel it cannot be pushed through a smaller ridge. Tighten the bolts evenly. The cable should be protruding from the center of the black rubber. Connect the tube to the hole on the luber tool. Wrap the luber tool with a rag or paper towels. It's normal for lubricant to spray out of the luber and cause quite a mess. We will use a lubricant designed for this application. You can find it at pretty much any dealer or a motorcycle store. Attach the aerosol lubricant to the tube. Spray bursts of lubricant. Check the bottom of the cable for lubricant that has traveled the entire length of the cable. Continue to spray lubricant until it can be seen exiting the lower end of the cable. As you can see, lubricant has filled the dust cover. This means that we have sprayed more than enough lubricant in the cable. We can also see that lubricant has sprayed out the lower end of the cable, causing quite a mess. To avoid spray, place a rag or paper towel behind the lower end of the cable. Even though we have sprayed plenty of lubricant in the cable, I will now spray more bursts to demonstrate the effectiveness of this luber tool. Again, this is far more lubricant than we need and for demonstration only. As you can see, the luber is very effective at pressurizing the lubricant so that it travels out to the lower end of the cable. As you can see, lubricant does tend to eject from the luber and onto my gloves. Make sure that the inner cable moves freely in the housing by moving it back and forth at the lower end and upper ends of the cable. Replace the cable if it's frayed or kinked. Apply grease to the bottom and top ends of the cable as instructed by the service manual. I am probably using much more grease than necessary here. Install the lower end of the cable into the bracket. Remember to move the bracket towards the engine when installing the cable. If you do not do this, it may be difficult to install the cable end into the bracket. Install the dust cover in its proper position. Install the upper end of the cable in the lever. The cable appears to be frayed, but it's actually just a piece of lint. If your cable is kinked or frayed, be sure to replace it. Reposition the lock nuts to achieve sufficient slack. Tighten the lock nuts against the cable bracket to achieve sufficient slack. Don't over-tighten. Turn the barrel adjuster so that it moves away from the lever mount until the proper cable slack is achieved. When proper slack is achieved, the gap between the lever and lever mount should be between 2 and 3 millimeters, as specified in the service manual. To measure the free play, pull the lever just enough to take up the slack in the cable, and measure the gap between the lever and lever mount. Confirm that there is enough thread on the barrel adjuster that is still in the lever mount. This cable may need to be replaced soon because cables stretch over time and there's not much thread left at the upper or lower ends of this cable. Finger tighten the lock nut against the lever mount. Check that the cable is seated properly in the barrel adjuster, and double check that the gap length is between 2 and 3 millimeters. The gap length you see here is probably a bit more than 3 millimeters. Make sure that there's at least 2 millimeters of free play in all steering positions. This concludes lubrication of the clutch cable. We are now ready to move on to part 2, throttle cable lubrication. As you can see, access to the lower ends of the throttle cables is blocked by the coolant reserve tank. To solve this problem, we must take out the mounting bolts of the reserve tank and push it aside. We will not have to drain the coolant and remove the tank completely, but only push it aside. We will have to remove this vent hose and remove the clutch cable ends so that we can push the clutch cable out of the coolant reserve tank bracket. Be aware that the service manual does not mention that the clutch cable routes through the coolant reserve bracket and must be pushed through it to separate the coolant reserve tank from the motorcycle. Although it does confirm that the clutch cable routes through this bracket in the routing section of the appendix. We will not have to remove this lower hose. If you do remove the lower hose, the coolant will spill on the ground. We will start by removing the vent hose. Press the clamp ends together to remove the clamp. Pull the clamp away from the nipple on the reserve tank. Then pull the hose off the nipple. Remove the clamp from the hose so that you can pull the hose through its bracket and push it aside. Pull the hose through its bracket. It's difficult to see the bracket because it's behind a fairing mount. Put the clamp back on the hose so you don't lose it. You may want to tuck the hose under the gas tank so that it doesn't get in the way. Here is the bracket that the hose routes through. You may assume that the clutch cable routes through this bracket as well, especially given that the cable seems to bump up against the bracket. But the clutch cable does not route through this bracket. The service manual confirms this in the routing section of the appendix, where it specifically says that only the coolant vent hose routes through the bracket. Now we will disconnect the ends of the clutch cable. There is a certain sequence that you must follow to disconnect the cable ends. This sequence may seem overly complicated, but it is necessary to gain the slack required to disconnect the cable ends. Begin by loosening the lock nut at the upper cable end and thread it as far away from the lever mount as it'll go. Then turn the barrel adjuster so that it moves into the lever mount. Move it towards the lever mount as far as it'll go. This will maximize cable slack at the upper end of the cable. Then loosen the lock nuts at the lower end of the clutch cable with two 12mm open-ended wrenches and rotate the lock nuts until they move as far up the threads as possible. This maximizes slack at the lower end of the cable. Then at the upper end of the clutch cable, line up the slots on the lock nut and barrel adjuster with the slot on the lever mount so that the cable can be removed. Line up the cable with the slot under the lever so that the cable can be removed from the lever. This is what the barrel adjuster looks like if you thread it out of the lever mount, but you don't need to thread it out of the lever mount. This is for visual reference only. At the bottom end of the clutch cable, move the dust cover out of the way and remove the lower end of the clutch cable from the bracket. Be aware that this can be very difficult if you do not remove the cable end in a certain way. To do this, move the bracket towards the engine as you try to push the cable end out of the bracket. At the bottom end of the clutch cable, remove the lower nut from its threads. Then, pull the cable out of its mounting bracket. We must also remove the second nut from the threads to pull the cable through the bracket on the coolant reserve tank. Move the clutch cable up through the bracket on the coolant reserve tank. Position the nuts so that they move through the coolant reserve tank bracket. Push the clutch cable aside. We don't have to remove the cable completely, just push it aside. You may want to tuck the clutch cable under the gas tank to get it out of the way. Now we will remove the coolant reserve tank mounting bolts. There is one washer and one very long spacer on this bolt. The other bolt is much smaller and has no spacer, only a washer. You can hang the reserve tank from its hose, but it's probably better to use a reusable tie wrap to take some stress off the hose. Hang the tank from the radiator hose and avoid tilting the tank too much, or else coolant may leak from the top. Again, we don't have to remove the reserve tank completely or drain the coolant. Just push the tank aside. As you can see, we now have much better access to the lower ends of the throttle cables. Now we must remove the lower ends of the throttle cables. Turn the throttle linkage lever so that the lower end of the accelerator cable can be accessed more easily. Check the condition of the cable. If it's frayed or kinked, replace it. Now we will remove the lower end of the decelerator cable. The decelerator cable gives the rider the ability to disengage the throttle if it sticks. Check the condition of this cable as well. Look for frays or kinks on the inner cable. Now we will remove the switch housing on the right side of the handlebars. Remove the two Phillips head bolts joining the two halves of the housing. The bolt on the bottom is longer than the bolt on the top. Separate the two halves of the switch housing. It may be difficult to remove the half on the right from between the brake lever and the grip. This is where the accelerator cable goes into. This is the accelerator cable. This is where you adjust the accelerator cable slack at the upper end of the cable. This is the decelerator cable. Now we will remove the upper end of the decelerator cable and the upper end of the accelerator cable. As you can see, the throttle grip moves freely once the cables are detached. Again, this is the upper end of the accelerator cable and the upper end of the decelerator cable. To avoid a mess, place paper towels under the lower end of the throttle cables before using the luber tool. We will start by lubricating the decelerator cable. Again, we are using much more lubricant than is necessary, only to demonstrate the effectiveness of this Luber tool. You only need to spray until you see lubricant exit the bottom end of the cables. Make sure that the cable moves freely in its housing by moving the lower and upper ends of the cable back and forth. Lubricate upper and lower cable ends with grease. To use the Luber tool on the accelerator cable, we must remove the cable end. Screw the cable slack adjuster out of the cable end. Removing this last part of the cable end can be extremely difficult. You can try a flathead screwdriver, but be careful not to stab yourself or damage the cable. Because this cable end has been removed repeatedly, it comes off with my bare hands. But again, be aware that if you're removing the cable end for the first time, you will not be able to remove it with your bare hands. You will need some sort of tool. There may be a special tool for this, but the service manual certainly does not mention such a thing. Now we will lubricate the accelerator cable. Again, we are using much more lubricant than is necessary, only to demonstrate the effectiveness of this Luber tool. As we did with the decelerator cable, make sure that the cable moves freely in its housing by moving the ends back and forth. Replace the cable if it's kinked or frayed. Grease the ends of the accelerator cable as we did with the decelerator cable. Make sure that the spring of the throttle linkage lever functions properly. Install the lower ends of the throttle cables on the throttle linkage lever. Install the accelerator cable end onto the cable and thread the cable slack adjuster into it. Route the throttle cables like so. The service manual provides a cable routing diagram. This is the accelerator cable, the decelerator cable, and the electrical wires. Lubricate the switch housing and throttle drum with a type of grease that will not melt the plastic. The climber manual suggests lithium grease for this application. Begin assembling the switch housing by installing the cable ends on the grip holders. This is the accelerator cable. This is the decelerator cable. The decelerator cable fits into the left side of the switch housing like so. The slot on the slack adjuster of the accelerator cable will fit into this protrusion. Make sure that these protrusions fit around the gray part of the grip, and that the cable runs between the protrusions and down the center of the gray part of the grip. Be sure that the accelerator cable fits properly into its adjuster end. Again, make sure that this slot on the accelerator adjuster end fits into the protrusion next to the decelerator cable. Now we will install the other half of the switch housing. Be sure that this protrusion on the housing fits into the hole in the handlebar. It may be difficult to position the switch housing between the brake lever and the grip. Move the grip flare out of the way to assist installation. Make sure that these protrusions fit around the gray part of the grip, and that the cable fits between the protrusions and down the center of the gray part of the grip. Hold the accelerator cable end in place with your left finger so that it doesn't fall out of place while you install the second half of the switch housing. Move the assembly back and forth or from side to side until you feel the protrusion on the switch housing enter the hole in the handlebar. Install the Phillips head bolts. The longer bolt should be placed in the lower hole. Check the switch housing to confirm that the two halves fit together properly and that the cables are seated correctly. The free play in the grip indicates the degree of throttle cable slack. Measure the free play. Use the seam on the grip as a reference point. As you can see, the free play is about 8 millimeters. The service manual calls for free play between 2 and 3 millimeters, as with the clutch cable and choke cable. To decrease free play, turn the barrel adjuster so that it moves away from the switch housing. Continue to move the barrel adjuster until the proper cable slack is achieved. As you can see, the free play is now a little over 3 millimeters. Once the proper free play is achieved, tighten the lock nut. Check the throttle free play in all steering positions to make sure that the throttle does not open on its own. Then check that the throttle snaps back in all steering positions. If the throttle does not snap back on its own, check the routing of the cables and lubricate the switch housing and throttle drum with a type of grease that will not melt the plastic. The climber manual suggests lithium grease for this application. If you cannot attain the proper free play at the upper end of the throttle cables, adjust the lower end of the cables. Be aware that the mounting brackets for the lower end of the cables have safety tabs that prevent the lower nuts from loosening. These tabs make it difficult to adjust the nuts in the same way that the clutch cable nuts are adjusted. We will demonstrate how to cope with this problem on the accelerator cable. The procedure for the decelerator cable is the same. Loosen the upper nut and move it up the cable as far as it'll go. Then pull the cable down to move the lower nut away from the safety tab. This will allow you to move the lower nut to the position you want it. Move the nut down to decrease cable slack. Move the nut up to increase cable slack. Once you place the lower nut in the desired position, push the cable up until the lower nut presses against the bracket, and then move the upper nut down and onto the bracket and tighten it. You only have to tighten the upper nut. The safety tab will keep the lower nut from moving. After adjusting the lower ends of the cables, readjust the upper end of the accelerator cable. Turn the barrel adjuster at the upper end of the accelerator cable away from the switch housing until the proper free play is achieved. Then tighten the lock nut against it. Double check that the free play in the throttle grip is between 2 and 3 millimeters. Reinstall the coolant reserve tank. Remember, there are 2 bolts, one long and one short. The long bolt has a very long spacer and washer. Installation of the long bolt can be finicky. As you screw it, move the reserve tank side to side slightly, or up and down slightly until you feel the long bolt catching on its threads. Be patient. Here's what the coolant reserve tank mounting bracket looks like without the bolt installed, and here's what the bracket looks like from the rear with the bolt installed. The short bolt has a washer, but no spacer. Again, move the bolt up and down or side to side until it catches on the threads on the mounting bracket. Have patience. Run the clutch cable through the bracket on the coolant reserve tank. Be sure that the clutch cable is positioned on the side of the bracket closer to the motorcycle, and that the coolant hose is on the side of the bracket further from the motorcycle. Position the lock nuts so that they move through the bracket. Again, the clutch cable does not route through the same bracket that the vent hose routes through. Install the upper nut onto the threads in the cable and move it up as far as it'll go. Place the cable in its bracket and pull it down as far as it'll go. Install the lower nut onto the threads. Install the lower end of the cable into the bracket. Remember to move the bracket towards the engine when installing the cable. If you do not do this, it may be difficult to install the cable end into the bracket. Install the dust cover in its proper position. Install the upper end of the cable in the lever. The cable appears to be frayed, but it's actually just a piece of lint. If your cable is kinked or frayed, be sure to replace it. Reposition the lock nuts to achieve sufficient slack. Tighten the lock nuts against the cable bracket to achieve sufficient slack. Don't over-tighten. Turn the barrel adjuster so that it moves away from the lever mount until the proper cable slack is achieved. When proper slack is achieved, the gap between the lever and lever mount should be between 2 and 3 millimeters, as specified in the service manual. To measure the free play, pull the lever just enough to take up the slack in the cable, and measure the gap between the lever and lever mount. Confirm that there is enough thread on the barrel adjuster that is still in the lever mount. This cable may need to be replaced soon because cables stretch over time and there's not much thread left at the upper or lower ends of this cable. Finger tighten the lock nut against the lever mount. Check that the cable is seated properly in the barrel adjuster, and double check that the gap length is between 2 and 3 millimeters. The gap length you see here is probably a bit more than 3 millimeters. Make sure that there's at least 2 millimeters of free play in all steering positions. Remove the clamp and pull the vent hose through its bracket. Install the clamp onto the hose and the hose onto its nipple. Install the clamp. This concludes part 2, lubrication of the throttle cables. We will now lubricate the choke cable. We will begin by removing the left fairing, the seat, and the gas tank. It is possible to lubricate the cable without removing these things, but you will not be able to grease the lower end of the choke cable or inspect and adjust the choke cable free play. Also, because the choke cable free play is adjusted at the middle of the cable, unlike the clutch and throttle cables, Lubricant has a tendency to spill out of the middle of the cable and onto the engine. To prevent this, you will need to remove the gas tank and put a paper towel or rag under the cable. The bottom line is that the choke cable is very difficult to access without removing the gas tank. Thus, I recommend removing it. Don't be afraid to remove the gas tank. The procedure is fairly simple and will be demonstrated here in detail with camera close-ups. First, remove the left side cover. There is one Phillips head screw and 3 stoppers inserted in grommets. Gently pull out the 3 stoppers one by one. There are 2 large hex bolts, one at the bottom of the bike and one at the middle of the bike. There are 2 smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. And 2 more hex bolts near the front of the bike. The last hex bolt connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Be aware that this bolt can be somewhat finicky to remove. It has a tendency to get caught up on the radiator fairing once it's removed from its threads. Take the nut plate off and put it in your organizer so it doesn't get lost. As with the right fairing, there are 3 small plastic rivets that secure the radiator fairing against the side and front fairings. You will only need to remove the lower 2. The third upper rivet connects the radiator fairing with the front fairing and is not necessary to remove. Disengage the rivets by pushing the button at the center with a pencil or some thin piece of plastic. Once the rivets are disengaged, they can easily be pulled out with fingernails. Disconnect the turn signal by pushing on the very end of the tab. These wires are not easy to detach, so you may need to use quite a bit of downward force on the tab to separate the connectors. When removing the fairing from the bike, you must keep track of 2 well nuts, 1 pad, and of course the nut plate mentioned previously. These are the 2 well nuts. They are black rubber with inner metal threading. The pad is supposed to stick onto the fairing but typically falls off. This is where the pad is supposed to be located. You can see the sticker residue. And this is the pad. It protects the gas tank from friction against the fairing. This pad was left uninstalled for thousands of miles. You can see where the fairing has rubbed against the gas tank. Remove the seat by loosening 2 hex bolts, one on each side of the bike. Each bolt has a spacer. Sometimes the spacer will fall out, other times it will stay lodged in its hole. As you can see, this spacer may be difficult to remove without first removing the seat. This second spacer came out with its bolt. To remove the seat, pull it straight back to disengage the hooks from their slots, then lift the seat straight up. We will now remove the gas tank. Begin by removing the two mounting bolts. Notice the direction arrow on the washer bracket. Place a 2x2x6 inch block under the gas tank to allow easy access to the fuel gauge, electrical wire and hoses. Don't worry about damaging the gas tank when lifting it up this way. The tank has two pieces which are designed to rotate on circular dampers. These are the dampers. First, remove the electrical wire for the fuel gauge. Then, remove the fuel hose and vacuum hose from the fuel tap. As you can see, it's difficult to reach the hoses without lifting the gas tank. Use pliers to remove the clamp on the fuel hose. The clamp on the vacuum hose is difficult to remove, difficult to install, and generally worthless, so you may want to replace it with a better one. The clamp doesn't open when the ends are pushed together, so the best way to remove it is to simply push it off. Place a rag or paper towel under the fuel hose because some fuel will drip during removal. Remove the fuel hose from the fuel tap. And remove the vacuum hose. Take off the clamps on the hoses on the front left part of the gas tank. If your motorcycle was made for a state other than California, then your bike may only have one or two of these hoses, not three. Be aware that the service manual does not mention these hoses in the fuel tank removal section, even though the hoses must be disconnected to remove the gas tank. It is probably best to leave the clamps on the hoses so that they don't turn up missing. After removing the clamps, Gently coax the hoses off their nipples with a flathead screwdriver. Don't damage the hoses or nipples with the screwdriver. Be prepared for some gasoline to spurt out when the hoses are removed because of pressure in the tank. Lift the front fairing pieces off the gas tank. The front fairing pieces may fall back into place when you attempt to remove the gas tank. Gently remove the gas tank, making sure that no wires or hoses are hung up on the motorcycle as you remove it. Don't smoke or expose the gas tank to any potential ignition source. Don't set the gas tank directly on its fuel tap, or else you may damage the tap. You can use 2 tissue boxes to keep the fuel tank off the ground. As you can see, the fuel tap clears the ground when the 2 tissue boxes are positioned on the side edges of the gas tank. Now we will disassemble the switch housing on the left side of the handlebar. Remove the 2 Phillips head bolts. Unlike the other switch housing bolts, these bolts are the same length. Now separate the 2 halves of the switch housing. These are the electrical wires. This is the choke cable and choke lever. Separate the cable end from the choke lever. Now we will disconnect the lower end of the choke cable, which is located on the front of the carburetor. This is a view from the rear of the bike. And a view from the front of the bike. And a view from the left side of the bike. And a view from the right side of the bike. And again, a view from the rear of the bike. Now we will remove the lower end of the choke cable. Push the cable down so that it can move out of the opening at the bottom of the bracket. Here is a shot of the cable removal from the rear. And a shot of the cable removal from the top of the bike. Now we will pull out the lower cable end. As you pull the cable out, move it towards the rear of the bike so that it clears this metal fold. Here is a view of the metal fold from the rear of the bike. Here's a view from the left side of the bike. As you can see, the bottom part of the choke cable fits into the metal fold, which is shaped like a tent. And here is a view a little farther away. To use the Lubritool, we must remove the adapter on the upper end of the choke cable. Twist the adapter to assist removal. Unlike the clutch and throttle cables, the choke cable is adjusted at the middle of the cable. Consequently, lubrication tends to spill out at this location. Place a rag or paper towels under the middle of the cable so that the lubricant does not spill on the engine. Also, place a rag or paper towel under the lower end of the cable to avoid spilling and spray. Once lubricant can be seen exiting the lower end of the cable, you can be sure that the cable has been sufficiently lubricated. I'm spraying far too much lubricant on purpose just to demonstrate the effectiveness of this Lubritool. Install the cable adapter onto the upper end of the cable. This may take a little effort in toying around. Make sure that the cable adapter is positioned far enough onto the cable, or else you may not be able to achieve enough cable slack to install the two halves of the switch housing onto the cable. In this shot, the adapter was not installed far enough onto the cable. You'll probably have to twist it a little farther. Check that the cable moves freely in its housing. Grease the upper and lower ends of the cable. Install the lower end of the cable. Make sure that the metal part of the cable housing fits into the metal fold, which is shaped like a tent. Here are many views of the installation of the lower end of the choke cable into the metal fold from many different angles. While holding the cable end with one finger, push the cable down with another finger so that it can fit into the opening at the bottom of the bracket. The lower cable end is now properly installed. To make sure there is enough slack to connect the two halves of the switch housing, adjust the choke cable to maximize slack. As mentioned previously, the choke cable is adjusted at the middle of the cable, unlike the clutch and throttle cables, which are adjusted at the ends of the cables. Use two 8mm open-ended wrenches to loosen the small lug nut at the left and thread it up the cable as far as it'll go. Then thread the adjuster as far up the cable as it will go. Then install the upper end of the choke cable in the choke lever. Be sure that the cable is seated properly in the adapter. Put the cable adapter into the mold in the switch housing. As with the housing on the other side of the handlebar, this housing has a plastic protrusion that fits into the hole in the handlebar. Hold the cable end in its proper position in the switch housing with one hand while moving the grip flare out of the way with the other hand to install the housing half onto the handlebar. The cable adapter should fit into the switch housing like so. While holding the first half of the switch housing with one hand, install the second half of the switch housing. Rotate the switch housing from side to side and move it up and down until you feel confident that the protrusion on the housing has entered the hole in the handlebar. Install the two Phillips head bolts. Again, these two bolts have the same length. The threads in the housing are plastic, so don't over-tighten. Now we will adjust the choke cable free play. To be sure when the choke is engaged and when it's not, look to a small brown circular piece of metal on the left side of the carburetor, called the starter plunger. When the choke is engaged, this bracket will pull the starter plunger out. To demonstrate, we will pull the choke lever back completely. Notice that the bracket has pulled the starter plunger out. This means that the choke is engaged. After we push the lever back at the handlebar, the plunger returns to its original position, meaning the choke is disengaged. To measure the slack in the cable, pull back the choke lever just enough so that the bracket touches the plunger but does not pull it out. Notice that the bracket moved up against the plunger, but not enough to pull the plunger out of its position. Thus, we have taken up the slack in the choke cable. Now we can measure the free play at the lever by measuring the gap between the lever and switch housing. You can also tell when the choke is engaged by feeling the point of resistance at the lever. This is a way to monitor the free play without taking the fairings off. But the only way to know for sure that the choke is engaged is by observing the starter plunger on the carburetor. Now we will measure the free play. The service manual calls for a gap between 2 and 3 millimeters, the same for the clutch and throttle cables. This gap is between 4 and 5 millimeters. Turn the adjuster nut down the cable and away from the lock nut until the proper gap length and thus proper free play is achieved. Now we will measure the free play at the lever. The gap length is now about 3 millimeters. Once the proper free play is achieved, tighten the lock nut up against the adjuster nut Again, these nuts are the same size, so you will need 2 wrenches of the same size to tighten or loosen them. The nuts are 8mm for this bike. Make sure that there's at least 2mm of free play in all steering positions. We are now finished lubricating the choke cable and ready to install the removed parts. Start by installing the fuel tank. Be sure that the metal pieces on the tank fit around the circular dampers. And make sure that the dampers didn't fall off. Fit the fairing pieces onto the gas tank. Install the vacuum hose and fuel hose on the fuel tap. Install the vacuum hose clamp. Again, be aware that the vacuum hose clamp is not very effective and difficult to install. Simply pressing it with your fingers or pliers will not open the clamp sufficiently to allow easy installation. Thus, it's best to just pull the clamp over the hose, or you may choose to replace this clamp with a better one. Install the fuel hose clamp with pliers. Connect the fuel gauge wire. And connect the hoses at the front left part of the gas tank. Again, your motorcycle may have different numbers of hoses in this location of the gas tank depending on the year your bike was made or the state compliance. Install the hose clamps. Here's the proper routing of the hoses. Fit the overflow hose onto this bracket as instructed by the service manual. Remove the block and install the washer bracket. Make sure that the direction arrow is pointing towards the front of the motorcycle. Install the 2 bolts. Install the seat. Make sure that the hooks on the seat fit into the square holes on the motorcycle. Once the hooks fit into the holes, push the seat forward to lock it into place. Install the washers in the 2 hex bolts. You may need to push the seat down slightly so that the bolts enter the threads. Place the turn signal wire on the fairing tab so that you don't have to fish for the wire once the fairing is installed. Install the left fairing. Make sure that the bottom part of the fairing is positioned under the side stand. Make sure that the well nuts are positioned properly before installing the front part of the side fairing. Position the tabs near the handlebars so that they go into their slots. The upper tab on this motorcycle was snapped off. Make sure that the front fairing pieces fit properly onto the gas tank and under the fairing. Install the 2 large hex bolts. Install the two smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. Install the two smaller hex bolts near the front of the bike. Install the two lower rivets which connect the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Install the rivets in the open position. Then push the middle piece into place. Install the nut plate. Install the corresponding hex bolt which also connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. This bolt can be somewhat finicky to install. Connect the turn signals. Installation is the same for the right fairing, minus the three large rivets which serve to connect the right and lower fairing together. Place the turn signal wire on the fairing tab so that you don't have to fish for the wire once the fairing is installed. Install the right fairing. Make sure that the well nuts are positioned properly before installing the front part of the side fairing. This well nut is not installed properly. Position the two tabs near the handlebars so that they go into their slots. Make sure that the front fairing pieces fit properly onto the gas tank and under the fairing. Install the 2 large hex bolts. Install the 2 small hex bolts near the handlebars. Install the 2 small hex bolts near the front of the bike. Install the 2 lower rivets which connect the radiator fairings with the side fairing. Install the rivets with the middle pieces in the raised position. Then push the middle pieces into place. Install the nut plate. This nut plate is clamped on tightly and was not removed. Install the corresponding hex bolt which also connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. This bolt can be somewhat finicky to install. Connect the turn signal wires. Install the 3 large rivets that connect the right and left fairings together. Install the rivets with the middle parts in the raised position or completely removed. Then push the inner part of the rivets into place. And the second rivet. And the third rivet. Install the right side cover. Insert the 3 stoppers into their grommets. Each side cover has a Phillips head bolt. Install the bolt. Install the left side cover, insert the 3 stoppers into their grommets, and install the Phillips head bolt. This concludes lubrication of cables on a 2011 Ninja 250.